The relationship between the economy and the environment is fundamental. Nature provides us with raw materials and absorbs our wastes. We depend on the environment for the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the water we drink. We cut its forests for lumber and mine the earth for coal, ore, and minerals. We displace other species for our homes and shopping malls. We typically want more automobiles, bigger houses, more stuff. In a word, we want growth. Now, growth brings jobs, revenue, and development, but it also generates pollution and depletes precious resources. At the same time, most of us have an affinity for the natural world. As Leo Marx once commented, the natural world is the refuge of the spirit, remote, static, richer even than human imagination. But we can't exist in this paradise without the machine that tears it apart, so we're killing the thing we love. Now, how do we satisfy our desire for more without destroying the environment? Is our present form of civilization fundamentally incompatible with environmental quality? Until recently, we generally ignored our impact upon the environment. People continued to trash the highways until 1960s. Individuals thought nothing of dumping dirty car oil on the ground. Gas station owners found it cheaper to allow their storage tanks to leak than to repair them. And cities for years have used rivers as sewers. From a traditional economic perspective, nature is just another commodity. From that perspective, in and of itself, nature has no economic value. It only has value as lumber to build, land to develop, or ore to mine. So there's a derived demand for natural resources. But there are two widely divergent views regarding the environment. Advocates of market solutions to environmental problems claim that the market itself will solve environmental problems. If oil runs out, things will happen. For example, as oil supplies decline, the price of oil rises. This provides incentives to producers to find additional oil, or if no oil is found, to find substitutes. Well, this, however, rests on a series of assumptions that markets work, that technology will ultimately save us from ourselves, and that substitutes can be found. Others contend that the market is short-sighted. In the 1970s, a group of distinguished scientists published a book, Limits to Growth, warning people about the coming disaster. The scientists predicted the depletion of many resources within 40 years. Well, their predictions proved false, but their warning continues. In 40 years, the Earth's population will double. At present, the developed countries represent 26% of the world's population, but consume 80% of the world's resources. Now, can the rest of the world consume at our level? Are there sufficient resources? Can nature absorb our wastes? Well, no one knows for sure. As we said before, nature plays two roles, both as provider of natural resources into the production process and as a sink to absorb our wastes. Now, this prompts two questions. First, what's the optimum use of natural resources in order to sustain long-run economic growth? And second, how much pollution can nature absorb? In answering these questions, it's useful to distinguish two types of natural resources, renewable resources and non-renewable resources. Renewable resources are resources that can be replenished, such as forests and fisheries. Non-renewable resources are different. Their supply is fixed, and once they're gone forever. These resources include coal and oil. Now, there are three conditions for achieving sustainable growth. First, the harvesting of renewable resources can't exceed the growth of those resources. We can't continue to cut down more trees than are planted. Otherwise, there will be too few trees left, if any. Second, since non-renewable resources are fixed, in order to sustain the economy, renewable resources must be substituted for non-renewable ones. In the long run, we have to find alternatives. Coal reserves are estimated at 500 years. Oil reserves are estimated at less than 100 years. Ultimately, this means that to sustain the economy, we must switch to some form of alternative energy. For example, using solar energy by tapping sunlight directly or using plants that trap sunlight. And third, we can't continue to pollute more than nature's ability to absorb our pollution. The inability of nature to absorb pollution shows up, for example, in the greenhouse effect, a depletion of the ozone layer, higher temperatures, and increasingly severe weather. Still, nature's resilience is impressive. However, many products created by modern society do not easily break down. Plastic milk cartons last 100 years or more, plutonium may last 50,000 years before breaking down, and many steel products may never break down.
Each month, over 1,000 shipments of radioisotopes leave the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for universities, hospitals, and industrial plants all over the world.
If this seems a bit bleak, well, there's hope. Efforts to protect the environment are robust. People are more conscious of environmental issues. Most cities have introduced recycling programs. Every night on the evening news, weather forecasters predict next day's smog index. In winter, they also report the next day's burn regulations, and in summer, they warn us about the ozone levels. In 1992, the nations of the world gathered in Rio de Janeiro to discuss environmental issues. And closer to home, the U.S. Forest Service decided to reduce timber cutting in the Pacific Northwest to protect the spotted owl. Now, what should our position be with respect to the environment? Should human wants take precedence over the needs of the natural environment, or should the needs of the natural environment take precedence over human needs and wants? Should we try to maximize social welfare, or should we try to maintain kind of a balance of nature? Well, let's assume for the moment that our object is to maximize social welfare. From this perspective, both protecting the environment or trashing it may be consistent with maximizing social welfare. Both may reflect individual wants. The issue, however, is achieving what people want efficiently, a subject on which economics has a lot to say. 60 years ago, a famous economist, Arthur Pigou, taught us how to control pollution by means of taxes. Over the years, the profession has refined his teaching, but governments have barely listened. From its inception in 1972, the Environmental Protection Agency opted for direct regulation instead of the more flexible approach of adopting taxes and marketable permits. Let's begin by reviewing the efficiency of the ideal market, a perfectly competitive market characterized by no pollution. Well, as you know, this market tends to equilibrium at the intersection of the supply and demand curves. Recall that the supply curve measures marginal cost, that is, the cost in terms of land, labor, and capital of producing one more unit. On the other hand, the demand curve measures the marginal benefits of consumption, the benefits accruing to society of producing one more unit. At equilibrium, marginal benefits equal marginal cost. This equality always defines efficiency. Whenever the equality does not hold, inefficiency results. Now imagine, for example, that this is the market for electricity. In this picture, Q star is the equilibrium quantity of electricity sold in the ideal market. As such, Q star is a point of efficiency. The marginal cost of production equals the marginal benefits of consumption. In contrast, Q prime is inefficient. Why? Because the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefits. The vertical distance from the horizontal axis to the demand and supply curves measure the marginal benefits and costs. The areas underneath the curves measure total benefits and costs. Overall, the net total benefit of the existence of a market for electricity is the shaded area, the sum of consumer surplus and producer's profit. Recall that consumer surplus is the triangle underneath the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. Producer's surplus or profit is the area above the supply curve and below the price. But what happens when we leave the ideal market by introducing pollution? The existence of pollution implies an inefficiency. Why? Because the supply curve no longer reflects the marginal cost to society of producing one more unit. For example, in the process of generating electricity, power plants also create smog and acid rain. Generating electricity in the Midwest is a major contributor to acid rain downwind in New England and Canada. In addition to killing forests and fish populations, acid rain imposes costs on the people. There are many kinds of costs. Cost to fishermen, cost to campers and sightseers, cost to the owners of the forests and lakes, costs in terms of more expensive lumber, and thus higher housing costs, losses in property value to the owners of lakeside summer cottages, and then there are the aesthetic costs associated with the sight of urban smog near the generating plants. Now, these costs may be difficult to quantify, but they exist, otherwise people would not complain so much. Well, to see how things change, let's reconsider the electricity market diagram, but we add a new schedule to measure pollution costs. Suppose it turns out that we find 2 cents of pollution cost per each kilowatt hour of power. In the real world, the relation of these costs to electricity will no doubt be more complicated, but we'll keep them constant at 2 cents for simplicity. Economists call this the marginal external cost. An external cost is a cost which is not transmitted by prices. Marginal because it is measured per kilowatt hour, and external because it's not incurred by the power company and not necessarily by the power consumer. Now, even if consumers suffer smog due to electricity, they are unlikely to associate this pollution cost with the electricity they use. This is the key to why pollution is inefficient. Neither the buyer nor the seller necessarily bears the cost of the pollution. We will call any effect like this an externality. An externality is a cost or benefit involuntarily transferred from one party or parties to another. Externalities involve a breakdown in the market because they are involuntary. A cost or benefit is imposed upon you without your consent. Remember, market relations are based on voluntary cooperation. Now, we are now, of course, focusing on negative externalities, such as pollution, but externalities may also be positive. Imagine you're walking downtown and see someone that causes you great happiness. Perhaps they are dressed in a way that you find especially appealing. Perhaps they are playing a tune that brings back fond memories. Well, in either case, you're receiving a benefit for which you did not pay. Well, economic theory suggests that to correct this externality, you should compensate them for the benefits received. Well, let's take a non-trivial example of a positive externality, education. Education produces a positive externality because of the external social benefits arising from an informed citizenry and a well-trained workforce. This provides a strong justification for subsidies to public education. This also provides a rationale for government subsidies to immunization programs and medical research. Immunizing children, for example, against infectious diseases benefits society by reducing the likelihood of others catching the disease, and it avoids higher medical costs in the future. But now let's return to our discussion of pollution. Well, the sum of pollution costs and the cost to the firm, which are called the private costs, is called the marginal social cost. Social because it includes all the costs associated with electricity that are borne by society. Until now, we haven't distinguished between private and social costs. We've implicitly assumed that producers incur all the costs, so that their private costs are the same as the social ones. This was a simplification, of course. Well, look around and you'll see external costs everywhere. People are always imposing costs on each other in addition to those paid by the producers of goods and services. Economists, however, have a solution. You change the system so that the producers of externalities pay the full marginal social cost. To do this, you impose a tax on polluters equal to the marginal external cost. This is sometimes known as a Pigouvian tax after Arthur Pigou. We can add this to our diagram of electricity by imposing a tax of 2 cents per kilowatt hour on electricity paid by the power company. The effect is to shift the power company's supply curve up by this amount, so that the market, with the tax, comes to an equilibrium at the efficient point.
It's time once again for Smart Guy, Dumb Guy.
Hey, man, this is weird. An efficient level of pollution?
Yep.
Pollution sucks.
So?
Well, so why can't they just cut pollution to like 0?
Well, I'll tell you. Do you like The Simpsons?
Bart rules.
Okay, so we enjoy the things that we have. We love our TVs, VCRs, stereos, lights, and so on. So what do we need?
We need power, man.
Right. And how is electricity generated?
I don't know. I guess they build a power plant.
And burn coal. And what's a byproduct of coal?
pollution, I know all that, but I mean, why can't they just cut the pollution out?
Well, because pollution is a byproduct of production. We can reduce it, but we can't eliminate it. And to reduce pollution costs an awful lot of money. So, how much are you willing to spend for clean air? You willing to give up your car?
Oh, they can have my car, man. What I really need is my board.
Now, how can any amount of pollution be socially optimal? Unfortunately, we can't produce without generating some pollution. The trick is not to eliminate pollution, but to balance the social costs of production with the social benefits. The explanation of this comes from marginalist thinking. People get benefits from electricity and also from clean air. The efficient outcome is the one that balances these so that the marginal benefits of electricity equal its marginal social costs, including those from pollution. Let's look at this diagram. Without the tax, price is at P1 and quantity is at Q star. It's clear that between Q double prime and Q star, marginal social costs exceed marginal benefits. Well, how can we tell? Because between them, marginal social costs exceed the demand curve. The area underneath the demand curve between Q double prime and Q star represents the benefits of producing more. The area underneath them, the marginal social costs. Similarly, producing a Q double prime is better than reducing pollution anymore. Why? Because if we reduce pollution any further, we must also reduce electrical production. The loss in benefits from producing less electricity exceeds the benefits from reducing pollution. We can see this on the graph below Q double prime, where the marginal benefit curve exceeds the marginal social cost curve. As undesirable as it may be, production requires some pollution, so no pollution is not optimal. There is, however, a practical problem with Pagu's solution, namely setting the correct tax level. The problem lies in estimating the costs of pollution. We need to get it right. For if the tax is too low or too high, there's an inefficiency. Too low a tax would reduce pollution too little, and too high a tax will reduce it too much. Our solution to this problem is to use marketable pollution permits. In this situation, the EPA doesn't need to estimate the perfect tax rate. They need only determine the correct amount of pollution. For example, the EPA could hire biologists to determine just how much pollution could be tolerated so that the fish in those Canadian lakes do not die, so that the forests continue to thrive. Then, of course, we need to relate that pollution level to its corresponding level of electrical production. Now, this still might be a difficult problem. The EPA then sells permits. Each permit allows polluters to emit so much pollution. We can illustrate what happens graphically. The vertical axis displays the cost of pollution abatement per unit. The horizontal axis measures the quantity of pollution. Without government intervention, the firm has no incentive to reduce pollution. In this case, the level of pollution is at POL sub 2. By requiring permits, though, the firm will reduce the amount of pollution to POL sub 1. Why? Because to the right of POL sub 1, the costs of the permit exceed the cost of reducing pollution. The firm can minimize its cost by purchasing pollution control equipment. The firm won't reduce pollution below POL sub 1 because below that point, the price of the permit is less than the cost of purchasing pollution control equipment. In either case, producers bear a burden of the cost of pollution, causing the price to rise and the quantity produced to fall, thereby restoring equilibrium. Theoretically, the price of the product will be exactly the same under permits as it would be under an ideal Pagovian tax. There are several reasons why permits are preferred to taxes. First, permits need not generate any additional taxes. A second advantage is that permits are marketable. This enables the price of permits to reflect local conditions. In some areas, the demand for electricity may be stagnant and consumption may be easily cut by conservation measures. Other areas may be rapidly growing because people are moving there to take advantage of local amenities or to take jobs in dynamic new industries. These areas will have difficulty cutting electricity supply. It could be quite difficult for the EPA to foresee which areas will experience the highest demand. This could be a problem if permits were non-transferable, but not if they can be bought and sold. Marketable permits will naturally be purchased by the boom towns. A third and perhaps the most important advantage is that permits give polluters an incentive to reduce pollution. They become a willing partner in the fight against pollution. Now, permits, of course, are not just for power companies. Anyone can buy them. If the marginal external cost is truly greater than the market price of the permits, then there's an advantage for those who suffer from the pollution to organize into an environmental action group. This is the approach of the group known as the Nature Conservancy. They have for many years been in the business of buying plots of environmentally sensitive land. Either permits or taxes have the potential to achieve the efficient level of environmental protection. So does direct governmental regulation, but with regulations, there's much more that can go wrong. The current system of environmental protection in America is overwhelmingly one of direct regulation. Now, Congress passed a single auto emission standard that applies to the whole country. Now, does unpolluted Vernal, Utah have the same need as Washington, D.C.? The EPA sets regulations for power companies concerning the heights of their chimneys and the types of stack scrubbers required. But sometimes regulations backfire. Solving one problem sometimes creates another. For example, EPA required the power companies to build taller chimneys to reduce local pollution. The higher chimneys, though, sent sulfuric acid particles into the stratosphere, where they could travel the long distance from the Midwest to New England and Canada to fall as acid rain. Well, there's a third solution besides regulation, and that's to assign property rights. From this perspective, pollution becomes a problem because clean air or water is owned in common for anyone to use. This is fine if the resource is limitless. Regardless how much an individual uses, there's plenty for others to use as well. But if the resource is limited, then my use affects your use. If I use all the resource for myself, I leave none or little for you. Air and water are scarce resources, but historically they are provided free. In other words, the price of zero does not reflect their scarcity. The result is that individuals use too much. A solution to this problem suggested by Nobel laureate Ronald Coase is to assign property rights and to allow the parties to negotiate. Suppose, for example, that Geneva Steel emits pollution that imposes a cost on the people of Utah Valley. The costs are real. The pollution is unsightly. There's a reddish-brown smoke that billows from the plant. And studies indicate that the amount of lung-related diseases and deaths are higher as a result of the pollution. There are, however, two ways to resolve the problem from Coase's viewpoint. We can assign property rights to the air to Geneva Steel, or we can assign them to the residents. Assume for the moment that Geneva is assigned the property rights. What then? Geneva Steel owns the air over Utah Valley, not the residents. If the residents don't like the pollution that the steel company emits, then they can pay Geneva to reduce its pollution. As a profit-maximizing firm, Geneva Steel will only reduce pollution if the compensation paid by the residents equals or exceeds the revenue generated by polluting. Let's suppose instead that the residents own the air. What then? Geneva Steel must pay the residents for the pollution. Now, how much should be paid? This gets difficult, but theoretically, the amount should be sufficient to compensate or exceed the cost borne by the residents. But what happens in situations where property rights are not assigned? Coase has a solution, and that's the doctrine of ethical neutrality. The idea is to remain neutral, that is, to avoid placing the blame for the pollution. The polluter is no more responsible for the pollution than the victim. That is, Geneva Steel is no more responsible than the residents. After all, the residents could conceivably move. Now, what does this doctrine mean? It means that resolving the problem of pollution is a matter of reducing transactions costs. As the name implies, transactions costs are the cost of conducting transactions, that is, the cost of making an exchange. Coase argues that the solution resolves itself into minimizing the transactions costs. The solution resolves itself in answering the following question. Which would be cheaper, for Geneva Steel to compensate residents or for residents to pay Geneva Steel not to pollute? For Geneva Steel to pay the residents for pollution, Geneva would have to identify the affected parties. It would have to identify the extent of their pain and so on. The transactions cost would be considerable. On the other hand, for residents to pay Geneva Steel not to pollute, they would only have to deal with one party. The transactions cost would be much less. Curiously, the doctrine of ethical neutrality is anything but neutral, for in general, the doctrine of ethical neutrality benefits the polluter. Economists can help deal with the problem of pollution, but they've largely been ignored. In the late 1980s, the sulfur and nitrogen emissions tax bill was introduced for debate in the House of Representatives, but it lost. A tax on carbon emissions was discussed at the United Nations Summit in Rio, and it was ignored. In its Earth Day issue in 1990, Time magazine had a list of recommended policies. One was the carbon tax, but most were the same sort of old regulations, such as tough fuel efficiency standards for autos, banning the export of waste, and banning chlorofluorocarbons. The bans and standards approach have proven rigid and costly. Well, there's another dimension to the problem of pollution. In 1988, Lawrence Summers, at that time chief economist of the World Bank, wrote a memo advocating that the bank finance pollution-intensive industries in the Third World. His reasoning was clever. He argued that Third World nations are underpolluted. They have low incomes, clean air, and they need jobs. Pollution reduction, he argued, is a luxury Third World nations can't afford. Hence, it makes sense to locate polluting industries in the Third World nations. Now, what does this imply for people living in Utah? In many ways, Utah is in a similar situation. It's a state with wide open spaces, a relatively low population, and outside the Wasatch Front, relatively clean air. In California, clean air is at a premium, meaning that requirements to reduce pollution are much more stringent. It follows that pollution abatement costs more in California than in Utah. But California needs electricity. The solution, build the Intermountain Power Plant in Delta, Utah. California gets power and Utah gets jobs. But from another perspective, the IPP plant enables California to export its pollution to Utah. Similar examples abound. The East Carbon landfill accepts waste from all over North America. The rubble for the Los Angeles earthquake of a few years back ended up in the East Carbon area. Toxic waste dumps exist in Tooele County. A number of years ago, the Energy Department proposed placing a nuclear waste disposal site just outside Canyonlands National Park. Well, why Utah? Our low population means that disposing waste in Utah is less expensive than many other places. There are certain issues in applied economics that generate heated discussion where proposed solutions are controversial. The economics of environmental protection is one of the best examples. At the heart of the problem is the existence of external effects from production that aren't captured in market prices. This results in the overproduction of certain commodities. An engineering approach is to regulate industries by setting emission standards that producers must meet. Economic approaches are more flexible and give producers more freedom of choice. But, as we've seen from this and previous segments involving difficult choices, economic solutions can be harsh. Capitalism may be efficient, but it's not known as a system that's especially humane. Now, whether or not the environment should receive special attention that goes beyond a consideration as a factor input is an important question, and we hope you can play a part in arriving at a good answer.